Welcome everyone to the final round of the Weissenhaus Freestyle Chess GOAT Challenge 2024. We have the man behind this entire tournament, Magnus Carlsen, taking fourth. Against him is the one and only Nodirbek Abdusattorov. One can also say Carlsen's nemesis because Nodirbek has in the past given Carlsen quite a tough time at the World Rapid 2021, at Tata Steel Chess, and so many other tournaments. Let's see how this one goes. Nodirbek has the white pieces. If we look at the position, we have two bishops in two corners, and we have in the corner, and we have the queen in the other corner. So it's quite a weird position. Both players drinking a water before it begins, and there we have shake of hands, and Nodirbek opens the game with one f4. Logical opening up one of his bishops, and I think soon he will play g3 to open up the other bishop. Magnus plays g6 to open his other bishop in the position. Nodirbek goes g3. So with this, he's managed to put both his bishops in good positions, and now Magnus plays pawn to f5, gaining space on the king side. Nodirbek plays the move to a4, very interesting move. He wants to go a5, a6, make use of these bishops. A good idea now for black is to play his own pawn to a5, but Magnus goes knight f6. For Magnus, the white's a pawn coming down the board is not a very bad thing, but in return, he wants to challenge the bishop with bishop d5. That's why he's allowing Nodirbek to play a5, which the young Uzbek GM has done so, and now bishop comes to d5, trading off one of the bishops, which would be a good news for black, but Nodirbek declines it. He puts his knight out on f3. If the white bishop moves away, then white can castle over here. That is quite normal. But Magnus goes b5. Whoa, that's an interesting move. He activates his queen on this diagonal, and Nodirbek does the opposite there, and now very logical is to take towards the center when after the queen trade the position is equal. But it seems like Magnus, taking his time, doesn't want to play the natural move, which is a takes b6, and so he's thinking quite a lot and takes cb6, which is actually a very, I wouldn't say a very bad move, but definitely a curious move. Why would you want to take with the c pawn and make your a pawn into a weakness? Now Nodirbek has a lot of play down the a file. He can double up with his queen and rook, and that he begins with queen a2, a nice little move, attacking the a7 pawn, also looking at f7 square. Queen moves up to b7, and now it's time to double down the a file. Slowly and steadily, Magnus Carlsen being put under pressure there. A pawn is attacked. If you play a move like a5, that is really bad because then the b pawn becomes weak. So he goes a6. He wants to play b5 and he would be fine. But Nodirbek instantly jumps with knight a4. And the point is now the bishop and knight combine to attack here, and with b5, his knight would jump to c5. Maybe that's the lesser evil, but Magnus gives up his bishop. Queen takes, and now the bishop on h1 is smiling through his teeth. This is actually a very dangerous position for Magnus. b5 played, and now Nodirbek can give a check with his queen. And here's a variation that can show you how dangerous the position is. After queen a5 check, if queen c7, there is bishop b6, game over. So you need to play king e8, and that is exactly what Magnus has done. And now the bishop moves to the center of the board. The confidence with which Nodirbek is playing here is immense, and his point is now to connect his bishop with the rook so that the knight can move. Knight comes to e4, and it's trying to block this bishop. Also trying to exchange one pair of bishops there. And Nodirbek now takes on h8, rook takes h8, and there can be some deadly discoveries here. Yes, he goes d3, he's pushing the knight away, the knight has to move away, and then the bishop is looking at the queen. The good news for Magnus is that there is no real way in which white can take advantage of that attack on the queen. but it can become a long-term issue. Knight goes to d4. Fantastic move there by Nodirbek, looking at the queen, and now the queen moves to c7. He wants to trade the queens. What Magnus is essentially saying to Nodirbek is that, look, I know you are better. That can also be seen from the body language of Magnus. I know that a6 is weakness on an open file. But what I'm going to do is, I'm going to keep my knight here, keep this defended for as long as I can. Nodirbek, on the other hand, says, I don't care, I'm just going to coordinate my pieces. I move my king up, I'm going to double on the a file. So I'm going to play rook a2, rook a1, then move my knight away, maybe knight b3, but I'm going to somehow get in. He goes c3. And now after king e7 plays knight c2. Fantastic move there. Not knight b3 as I was imagining, but knight c2 with the idea of knight b4. Magnus wants to go a5 somehow, get some activity rolling. But this is clearly not going to be easy to do, because Nodirbek goes rook a5, blocking those two pawns. They are not moving ahead. The other rook is coming in. The knight is jumping here. The a6 pawn is terribly weak. You can see Magnus under big pressure. He plays his knight out to c6. And well, this is a mistake. But then again, d5 would have been better. But Magnus thinks he can give up a pawn. Takes, pawn takes. And now Nodirbek is going to just simply move his knight, bring his rook, and chop off the a6 pawn. He brings his knight to b4. Good move. Magnus brings his king up to d6 to defend the c6 pawn. The other rook moves in. The other rook comes in here. Now notice, if you take here, 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 and here, and then c5, the knight might get trapped. Which is the reason why Nodirbek takes directly with the knight, which is very logical. He is not afraid of this pin because he knows that at some point he can play the move b4, protecting his rook. Knight comes to g4 by Magnus and attacks the pawn on h2. Essentially, Magnus has some kind of, time, because the a6 knight is pinned, and that's why he's using his knight to distract some of the white pieces. And so with h3, now knight goes to f2, attacking the h3 pawn once again. And I think Nodirbek can simply play h4 and save his pawn. Yes, that's what he does. h4, and Magnus goes knight h1. Right after this pawn on g3, the knight can be taken for sure. But then black can take the a6 knight, and we will go into a rook endgame where the Uzbek GM is a pawn up against Magnus. But Magnus is known for his endgame skills, and he is often called as the god of endgames. Will he be able to hold this endgame is the question. Will Nodirbek be able to win? He pushes his pawn h5, which is the best move there, creating another weakness on the h7 square. Magnus pushes the rook with two fingers, and now the b2 pawn is falling. It needs to be defended, so the king goes to c2, and the rook comes back, defending this pawn on h7. The argument that Magnus has here is that, look, my h7 pawn is weak, but so is your g3 pawn. Now go and defend it. So Nodirbek has also something to worry about in this position. And I think rook h3 makes a lot of sense. Just coming back, being patient, and now you can bring your king up here and slowly and steadily try to make progress as white. How is Magnus going to create problems for black? For white, he goes c5. And Magnus's plan here is to go c4 eventually. King d2 played by Nodirbek. And what c4 will do in this position is create a weakness on the b2 square. So if we look at now Magnus playing c4, pawn takes, and king e3. The b2 pawn is a weakness, so it can always be attacked. But also the c4 pawn is weak because the king is coming up. So a lot to worry about for both sides. King c5 played, and now Nodirbek plays his king or the pawn. Does he want to take the pawn on f5? He plays his king to f3. The rook comes to the open file. Pawn takes pawn, and now attacks the f5 pawn. Magnus goes in with a check. Now very important here is to play king e2, give up this pawn, and actually rook h5, rook g2, king e3, and this is a winning endgame for white. But he goes here, check, and now Nodirbek must not go to h3. It's a bad move. But if you go back to f3, then you haven't made much progress because Magnus can check again. So Nodirbek makes a mistake. He goes king h3, and after rook takes b2, now the position, believe it or not, is drawn. Well, it's unbelievable that Magnus has managed to fight back here. That's the kind of an endgame genius that he is. King d6 is played. Now Magnus wants to go to c2 and chop off this pawn. Even if Nodirbek goes rook h5, it may not be easy. So rook e5 played, and very cool move, because if you go rook e3, there is rook d3 and you can't take because the pawn would queen. So that's the reason why he goes rook e4. He plays his rook to e4, attacking the pawn on c4. King comes to d5, and now Nodirbek moves his rook back. Well, in some elaborate way, Nodirbek has managed to attack the h7 pawn. He's taken it. Magnus takes the c pawn. Is it going to be the two connected pawns or the lone pawn, which is going to be more dangerous? Clearly, white is pushing here, but the game is still equal. Magnus plays a nice move, rook e3. He wants to push the pawn and then put his rook behind the pawn. That is his idea. Rook check. And now, where do you move your king? The best square to move the king is to c6. That's what he does. King to c6. And now, Nodirbek is taking his time because this is an important moment. He goes rook d4. And now, very important not to push the pawn. Just play king c5. It's an important moment. The variation can go rook d8. Here, check, king d5. And somehow, here, after rook c7, you are able to make some progress. And black is able to draw this. But Magnus blunders with pawn to c3. This is a big mistake. But Nodirbek has to find the only winning move here, which is f5 now. Will he find it? It looks like he's going to make that move. He has his hand there. Because now, in every race, the f pawn is also queening. And that is an important point here. f5 is a fantastic move by Nodirbek. If c2, you can see there Magnus really unhappy with himself. Also, very important to note, when the king comes to c5, later on f6, f7, f8 comes with a check to the king. So he goes king c5. Because clearly he had to make that move. Rook d8 played. And check, king goes to h5, another important move, king h5, because if he went to g5, then c2, c1 would have come with a check at later point. So, very, very smart there by Nodirbek. And now, you can't push the pawn to c2, so you have to maybe play rook c4, but then I have f6, c2, f7, c1 queen, and f8 queen check. That is the big problem there, which is the reason why Magnus now cannot play rook c4. Whoa, that was why f5 was a strong move, pushing your pawn forward. And so what can Magnus do now to pose some problems, because white is winning here? And Magnus is always very tricky in these endgames. He knows so many tricks, and maybe one of them works here. What is he going to do? Nodirbek's focus is so high that it will be very difficult to outwit him here. 11 minutes for Magnus. He's now going down on time. He's taking his time. He had a lot of time, but I think this is not going to work out for him. The other possibility here, of course, is to maybe bring your king into the position, but it's just too slow. After check, king b3, f6, the white pawn is way faster becoming the queen, while the black pawn is stopped easily. So that also doesn't work. Another problem here is that rook c4, which I think Magnus was banking on, is not working because of this pawn queening with check. So finally, Magnus Carlsen has to come up with something which keeps the game going. What would that move be? One plan is to play rook e5. You can see Magnus not being able to make those variations work. If rook e5, he plays it. He plays the move rook e5, which we were just about to analyze. Now the f5 pawn is hanging. You can go king g6. You can also push your pawn to g4. But I think Magnus's idea here is that he wants to, yes, g4 played by Nodirbek. His idea is to play king c4, so that later on if a check is given, he can block with the rook. That's what it seems he wants to do. Very nice. So if rook c8 played, now maybe just rook c5 and black is back in the game and can hold this. But Nodirbek, of course, finds the best move, rook d1, putting his rook in a very passive position, but it's like the rook is sacrificing his life for his side. What it's going to do is it's going to give up its life for the c2 pawn and then bank on the fact that these two pawns will win the game. King comes into g6, and now we can calculate this out till the very end, which Nodirbek most likely has done. King d2, he takes the pawn, king takes and pushes his pawn to f6. With these two pawns, one of them is going to net the rook, the other one is going to queen. Well, the only way that black can draw if his king was closer here. But turns out that the king is too far. So for example, if king d3, I go f7 and the pawn cannot be stopped anyway. So Magnus goes rook e3, trying to bring the rook behind the pawn. f7 is clearly also winning here. But so is the move g5, just bringing the other pawn into the game as well. Yes, pawn to g5. And now, I mean, Magnus needs to bring his king closer. There is something known as changing the guard in such positions where you go king f7 and try to push the other pawn. Here, there is no such need. In fact, such a thing would not work. But just push the f pawn because the black king is just too far. Rook f3 played, king g7. And now g6, Nodirbek wins. Magnus Carlsen has resigned. What a resounding win there for the youngster who dominated right from the opening until the endgame. There was one chance that Magnus had in the game to hold that rook endgame. It was not at all easy. Magnus Carlsen loses and Nodirbek wins the Rapid playoffs at Weissenhaus.